Welcome back. Settle in somewhere comfortable, dim the lights if you can. We're going to spend the next couple of hours walking through a story that most people have already moved past. A story about a man who woke up without memory in a world that had already decided it didn't need him anymore. This is the story of The Witcher, not the Netflix series with its gleaming armor and dramatic music, not even The Witcher 3, that sprawling masterpiece that everyone remembers. This is the first game, the one from 2007, the one with clunky combat and awkward animations and a world covered in perpetual gray. This is a story about mud and rain and candlelight, about returning to a world that kept turning while you were gone, about discovering that the legend everyone remembers isn't quite the same as the man you're trying to become again. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. Let's walk together through the forgotten corners of the continent, where the monsters are getting rarer and the witchers even more so, where kingdoms wage their wars and common people just try to survive another day, where a white-haired man wanders from place to place, looking for something he can't quite remember. This is The Witcher 1, and it begins as so many things do, in the middle of nowhere. Part 1, A World After Legends. The northern kingdoms had just finished bleeding. The wars with Nilfgaard were over. Not won, really, just over. The kind of ending where everyone's too exhausted to keep swinging swords, so they draw lines on maps and pretend those lines mean something. Temeria, Redania, Caedwen, Aedirn, names on paper, each kingdom nursing wounds that went deeper than battle scars. The world had moved on to other concerns, smaller concerns, trade disputes, border skirmishes, the price of grain, the things people worry about when they're not worried about armies burning their villages to ash. And in this world that was trying very hard to be normal again, there were fewer monsters. Not that they'd disappeared entirely. Drowners still lurked in shallow waters, waiting for travelers who strayed too close to riverbanks. Ghouls congregated in cemeteries, feeding on the recent dead. Bandits dressed themselves in whatever they could scavenge, which sometimes made them look more monstrous than the actual monsters. But the great beasts, the ones from the old stories, the dragons and griffins and things with too many names, they were becoming memories, legends you'd hear in taverns from old men who probably never saw them in the first place. This was not necessarily a good thing. You see, in a world with fewer monsters, there was less need for monster hunters, and witchers had always been specialists. They weren't soldiers, they weren't guards. They killed things that regular people couldn't kill, and they charged for the service, supply and demand, simple economics. When the supply of monsters dwindled, the demand for witchers dwindled with it. The world had tolerated witchers during the monster years, barely. Even then, people crossed themselves when a witcher walked into town, made the sign against evil, paid their coin, and sent the mutant on his way as quickly as possible. Because witchers were useful, but they were also wrong. Something about the eyes, those cat-like eyes that saw in the dark. Something about the way they moved, too fluid, too fast, like they weren't quite human anymore, which of course they weren't. The mutations that made a witcher also unmade something essential. The trial of the grasses, they called it. Adolescent boys, fed herbs and fungal extracts and alchemical compounds that rewrote their biology from the inside out. Most died screaming. The ones who survived emerged as something else. Faster, stronger, sterile, their emotions dulled, their humanity negotiable. They were tools, really, weapons pointed at darkness. And now the darkness was receding, leaving the tools lying around, awkward and unwanted. The schools were dying. Kaer Morhen, the Wolf School's ancient fortress in the Blue Mountains, had been sacked years ago by an angry mob. Jealous mages and frightened peasants working together for once to destroy what they feared. They'd killed many of the older witchers, stolen or burned the secrets of the mutations, left the keep a ruin. A handful of survivors remained, training grounds echoing with the footsteps of only a few, the cats, the griffins, the bears, all scattered across the continent in twos and threes, taking contracts where they could find them, traveling between towns that no longer rolled out welcome mats. The path, they called it, the wandering life. You followed the monsters because that's all you knew how to do, and when the monsters ran out, well, nobody had figured out what came after that. This was the world Geralt of Rivia was waking up to. Not that he knew his name at first. The rain had been falling for 3 days when they found him, or he'd been lying there for 3 days. Time wasn't particularly clear. Everything was fog and cold, and the feeling that he should be somewhere else, doing something important, but the details kept slipping away like water through fingers. They'd found him near Kaer Morhen. Found him might be generous. Dragged him might be more accurate. The Witchers, who still called the ruined keep home, had discovered a body in the woods, and when they checked for life signs, the body had groaned, close enough. Vesemir, the oldest of them, had made the identification. White hair, 2 swords, the medallion of the wolf school around his neck. This was Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf, the Butcher of Blaviken. Names that carried weight, apparently, though to the man himself they were just sounds without meaning. Amnesia, complete, total, the kind that erases not just memories but identity itself. He knew how to walk, how to speak, how to hold a sword. Muscle memory ran deep. But ask him where he'd been, who he knew, what he'd done with his life, and he came up empty, not even fragments, just absence. The Witchers told him stories, tried to fill in the blanks, told him he'd been traveling with a sorceress named Yennefer, that he'd died, or nearly died 5 years ago, that the Wild Hunt had chased him across worlds and through time, that he was, in many ways, already dead when they'd found him. None of this helped. The stories were interesting in an academic way, like hearing about a stranger's life. But they didn't resonate, didn't click into place. He was a man without a past, which meant he was a man without context, just the present moment stretching out in all directions, and the vague sense that he used to be someone important. Triss Merigold was there, a sorceress, younger than Yennefer, with auburn hair and nervous energy. She said they'd been friends, maybe more than friends. She was trying to help him remember, working spells and rituals that might shake something loose in his broken mind. The magic didn't work. Memory loss caused by trauma and magic, and sheer impossibility didn't respond well to traditional healing. Lambert was there too, and Eskel, fellow Witchers, brothers in all but blood. They trained together, moving through forms and exercises that Geralt's body remembered even when his mind didn't. The clang of steel on steel in the courtyard, the smell of oils and whetstones, the weight of a silver sword in his hand, which felt right even though he couldn't remember why. They told him this was home, that Kaer Morhen had been his home years ago before the path took him away. He looked at the crumbling walls, the empty rooms, the training yard where boys used to run through drills and most of them didn't survive. It felt hollow, like a museum of someone else's childhood, but there wasn't anywhere else to go, so he stayed. Days passed, weeks perhaps. Time moved strangely when you had no past to compare it to. Each day was the first day in a way. Wake up, train, listen to stories about the White Wolf, this legendary figure who apparently shared his face. Sleep, dream of nothing, wake up. The world outside Kaer Morhen's walls was distant and irrelevant. The northern kingdoms and their politics, the aftermath of war, the slow decline of Witchers as a profession, none of it touched him. He was a ghost haunting a ruin, and that felt appropriate somehow. Then Triss mentioned that she needed certain herbs, rare ones, growing only in specific regions. She'd have to go to Vizima, to the capital of Temeria, to find what she needed. The journey would take weeks. She'd be gone a while. Geralt offered to go with her. Not out of chivalry particularly, more out of boredom. The idea of seeing somewhere new, even if it wouldn't trigger memories, seemed better than staying in the keep and pretending he belonged there. Triss agreed they'd leave in a few days. Vesemir approved. Eskel and Lambert made jokes about Geralt finally leaving the nest again, getting back on the path, becoming the wandering witcher he used to be. It almost felt like things were moving forward. Then the bandits attacked. They came at night. Of course they came at night. In stories, bad things always happen at night. But this wasn't a story. This was mud and chaos and the sound of steel on stone as the gates burst open. Geralt was in the main hall when the alarm sounded. Triss was already reaching for magic. Lambert and Eskel scrambling for weapons. Vesemir shouting orders that nobody could quite hear over the screaming. The bandits weren't ordinary bandits. They moved too well, coordinated, professional, and they weren't there for gold or supplies. They were looking for something specific in the laboratory, deep in Kaer Morhen's stone belly. The Witchers kept their secrets, or what remained of their secrets after the sacking years ago. Formulae for potions, notes on mutations, the chemical and magical recipes that could theoretically create new Witchers if anyone was desperate or insane enough to try. The bandits wanted those secrets. Two figures led them. The first was a man called the Professor. Tall, thin, moved like a dancer, face hidden behind a mask. He fought with twin blades and no apparent conscience. The second was a mage, Azar Yavid. He wore robes that seemed to drink in light, and his magic hit like a thunderclap. All fire and force and casual cruelty. The fight spilled through Kaer Morhen like water through cracks. Geralt found himself moving on instinct, his body remembering what his mind couldn't. He cut through bandits with economical precision, using signs he didn't remember learning. Ard to knock enemies back, Igni to set them on fire, Quen to shield himself from blows. The magic came naturally, like breathing, but there were too many of them, and the Professor and Azar Javed were too skilled, too prepared. They'd planned this, known the layout, known exactly where to strike. Leo died in the laboratory. He was young, younger than the others, still in training. One of the last boys to go through the trials, one of the last chances the Wolf School had to continue. A bandit's blade found his throat, and that was it. No dramatic final words, no noble sacrifice, just blood and shock and absence. Lambert cradled the body. Eskel looked away. Vesemir's face turned to stone. Geralt felt nothing. Should he have? He didn't know Leo, didn't remember him, but the grief in the room was thick enough to choke on, and he understood, distantly, that something important had been taken. The bandits got what they came for. The Witcher secrets, whatever formulae and notes hadn't been destroyed in the original sacking, they grabbed them all and fled. The Professor moved like smoke, impossible to pin down. Azar Javed opened a portal and they stepped through, leaving Kaer Morhen to burn in small, smoldering ways. The Witchers put out the fires, buried Leo according to their customs, which meant burning him on a pyre and saying very little. Words didn't fix anything. In the aftermath, as dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, Vesemir made the decision. The stolen secrets couldn't be allowed to remain stolen. Whatever the bandits were planning, it involved Witcher mutagens, and that was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple theft. Those formulae in the wrong hands could create monsters, or worse, create tools that thought they were men. Someone had to go after them, track them down, get the secrets back. Vesemir looked at Geralt, the White Wolf, who didn't remember being the White Wolf, the legendary Witcher reduced to muscle memory and basic instincts, but still capable, still dangerous, and more importantly, still mobile. The others had responsibilities here. Geralt was, in a sense, free. So it was decided. Geralt would hunt the bandits, would follow them to whatever hole they'd crawled into, would take back what was stolen and make sure it couldn't be used. Triss offered to come along. She'd been planning to travel to Vizima anyway, and Geralt would need contacts, information, someone who understood politics and organizations. A witcher alone was just a sword looking for something to cut. A witcher with a sorceress backing him up was something else, something that might actually succeed. They left Kaer Morhen 3 days later. Geralt looked back once at the keep, at the mountains, at the place that was supposed to be home. It looked smaller in the distance, a ruin pretending to be a fortress. He turned away and started walking. The path was calling, even if he didn't remember what that meant. The bandits called themselves Salamandra. Geralt learned this through careful inquiry and less careful violence. In the towns between Kaer Morhen and Vizima, Salamandra had a presence, not overt, but there, hidden in plain sight. Merchants who asked too few questions, guards who looked the other way at the wrong times, tavern owners who suddenly got quiet when certain topics came up. It was an organization, professional, well-funded, connected to something larger that Geralt couldn't quite see yet. The attack on Kaer Morhen wasn't personal. It was business. Someone wanted Witcher secrets. Salamandra provided Witcher secrets. Simple as that. Following their trail was like following smoke. You could see where it had been, but never quite where it was going. Geralt moved from village to village, asking questions in the way Witchers ask questions, quiet, direct, with the implicit threat that answers were strongly encouraged. He learned that Salamandra dealt in things that shouldn't be dealt in. Narcotics, people, modified creatures that might have been monsters once, but were now something worse. They had influence in Vizima, the capital of Temeria. That's where the trail led. That's where Geralt needed to go. But getting into Vizima wasn't simple. The city was locked down, plague protocols in effect, security tighter than it had been during the war. Nobody got in without proper documentation, a letter of safe conduct, proof of legitimate business. Geralt didn't have any of that. He ended up in the outskirts, the collection of hovels and farms that existed in Vizima's shadow, close enough to the city to claim association, but far enough to be ignored when convenient. The outskirts was where people lived when they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Muddy streets, buildings that looked like they might collapse if you leaned on them wrong, the smell of unwashed bodies and desperation it would have to do. He needed a way into the city, and someone in the outskirts probably knew how to make that happen. Everything was for sale if you knew who to ask. The problem was that the outskirts had problems of its own. Part 2, the outskirts and moral exhaustion. People were dying at night, not unusual particularly. The outskirts wasn't the kind of place where life was especially valued or protected, but these deaths were different, violent, torn apart by something that left claw marks and terror. The villagers called it the Beast because they lacked imagination and because the name fit well enough. Geralt heard about it from Shani, a field medic, young, red hair, the kind of person who'd chosen to work in the outskirts because somebody had to. She tended wounds and delivered babies and tried very hard not to notice how many of her patients would be dead in a year anyway, from disease or hunger or simple bad luck. She recognized Geralt, or recognized the white hair, the cat eyes, the swords on his back, Witcher, monster hunter, problem solver, exactly what the outskirts needed, except nobody could afford to pay him. Geralt stayed anyway, not out of charity, more out of the realization that getting into Vizima required currying favor with someone who had influence, and helping the outskirts with their beast problem seemed like the fastest route to that favor. The Reverend would do. He was the local priest, representative of the Eternal Fire, the church that had gained significant power in the northern kingdoms during and after the war. Fire as metaphor for purity, for cleansing, for burning away corruption. The Eternal Fire's priests preached about order and righteousness and the inherent virtue of following their particular brand of worship. The reverend in the outskirts was a zealot, the kind of man who saw sin everywhere because he was looking for it, who preached about moral degradation while his congregation starved, who promised salvation but couldn't promise bread. He also had connections to the city, could provide letters of safe conduct, could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. So Geralt took the contract: find the beast, kill the beast, get paid in bureaucratic favor. It should have been simple. The outskirts was a place where bad things happened in slow motion. Geralt discovered this through investigation, through talking to the villagers, to Shani, to the handful of people who hadn't already died or fled. Each conversation revealed another layer of rot, another small cruelty, another compromise that had seemed reasonable at the time. There was Odo, the merchant, obese, loud, perpetually drunk. He'd inherited money from his brother, who died under mysterious circumstances that weren't particularly mysterious if you asked the right questions. Odo had killed his brother in his sleep, buried the body in the garden. His brother's dog still guarded the grave, waiting for a master who wasn't coming back. There was Harren, the innkeeper. He provided shelter and food, but only if you could pay. And if you couldn't pay, well, Harren knew people, knew organizations that were always looking for fresh bodies to work or sell or use in whatever way bodies could be used. He'd made arrangements, delivered goods to Salamandra representatives, children mostly, because children were easy to transport and easier to make disappear. There was the Reverend himself preaching purity while turning a blind eye to everything that made his position comfortable. He knew about Harren's deals, knew about Odo's crime, knew and did nothing because doing nothing was easier than doing something. The outskirts was a collection of small evils that had accumulated over time, like sediment in a river. Nobody had woken up one day and decided to be monstrous. It had happened gradually, one compromise at a time, one rationalization, one moment of looking away when looking would have been inconvenient. And now something was killing them. The beast, hunting at night, ripping people apart. Geralt tracked it, found clues, claw marks that weren't quite right, evidence that suggested the beast was a spectral hound, a hellhound, something born from violence and rage, the kind of creature that didn't appear naturally, the kind that was summoned, intentionally or otherwise. There was a witch in the outskirts, Abigail. She lived on the edge of things in a hut that smelled like herbs and something sharper. The villagers used her services when they needed healing potions or poisons, but they didn't like her. She was a woman living alone, practicing magic without oversight, existing outside the acceptable boundaries of what women were allowed to be. When Geralt asked about the beast, the villagers blamed Abigail immediately. Obviously, the witch had summoned it. Obviously, she was responsible. Obviously, this was what happened when you let someone like her live among decent people. The evidence didn't support this, but evidence was negotiable when fear was involved. Geralt found Alvin with Abigail. The boy was maybe 10 years old, thin, pale eyes that seemed to see too much. He'd survived a Barghest attack that killed his foster mother, traumatized, possibly source, meaning he had magical abilities he couldn't control. Dangerous, in other words. The kind of child that needed protection and also needed to be watched very carefully. Abigail had taken him in because Shani couldn't care for a child from an inn and nobody else would. She was trying to help, trying to do the right thing in a place where the right thing was rarely rewarded. Geralt needed to know about the beast, about what it was and why it was here. Abigail suggested using Alvin. The boy had power, visions. If they put him in a trance, he might be able to see the truth. So they did. Alvin drank a potion. His eyes rolled back, and when he spoke, it wasn't with his voice. It was with something older, colder, multiple tones layered over each other. He told them about the beast, about how it was born from innocent blood and guilty hands, from children who'd skinned a puppy alive just to watch it suffer, from a woman dragged to the woods and violated while men laughed, from gold stained with blood, from all the small cruelties that the outskirts had committed and then tried to forget. The beast was a manifestation, a curse. The village had created it through their own actions, and now it was hunting them one by one. Poetic justice, in a way, the kind that killed without mercy. When Alvin woke up, he was exhausted and confused, but Geralt had his answer. The witch hadn't summoned the beast. The villagers had, through their crimes, through their complicity, through their willingness to look away while evil happened in their midst. Geralt went to the Reverend with this information, explained what he'd learned, expected, perhaps, some kind of acknowledgement, some recognition that the problem wasn't external but internal. The Reverend didn't want to hear it. The Reverend wanted a scapegoat, wanted someone to blame who wasn't himself or his congregation, wanted the witch to burn and the problem to go away. He gathered the villagers, worked them into a frenzy, told them that Abigail had cursed them, that she was responsible, that justice demanded her death. The crowd turned into a mob, torches, anger, the kind of violence that people convince themselves is righteous. Geralt had to make a choice. He could side with the villagers, let them kill Abigail. It would make his life easier. The Reverend would be grateful, would provide the safe conduct letter, would open the door to Vizima, and Abigail was just one person. A witch, someone the world wouldn't miss. Or he could defend her, stand between the mob and their target, protect someone who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a way that made people uncomfortable. It would make enemies, would mark him as someone who didn't understand how things worked in places like this. There was no third option, no clever solution that satisfied everyone, just two bad choices, and the clock running out. Geralt looked at Abigail. She was terrified, but trying not to show it. Looked at the mob, faces twisted with fear and hate, and the desperate need to believe they weren't responsible for their own suffering. Looked at the Reverend, righteous and convinced, and so very certain that burning a witch would solve problems instead of creating new ones. He made his choice. The specifics don't matter as much as the result. Either Abigail burned and Geralt lived with that, or the mob died and Geralt lived with that. Either way, the beast needed killing, and either way, blood was spilled that couldn't be taken back. The beast appeared at night, a massive spectral hound, eyes like burning coals, claws that left frost where they struck. It moved like smoke, half real, sustained by anger and injustice, the kind of creature you couldn't negotiate with. Geralt fought it in the darkness. If he'd saved Abigail, she helped with healing magic. If he'd let the mob have her, the surviving villagers helped by being targets and dying quickly. Either way, it was Geralt's sword that ended things. The beast fell, dissolved, stopped being anything except a memory. The outskirts was quiet after that, the kind of quiet that follows violence. Nobody celebrated. Nobody thanked Geralt, regardless of which choice he'd made. They just went back to their lives, to the small cruelties and compromises that would probably summon something worse eventually. Geralt took the letter of safe conduct. The Reverend provided it, or Geralt took it from the Reverend's body, depending on how things had gone. Either way, he had what he needed, access to Vizima. Shani prepared to leave as well. She was going to the city to continue her medical training. The outskirts had nothing left to teach her except how to watch people die slowly. They traveled together, Geralt, Shani, and Triss, when she rejoined them. The road to Vizima was muddy and cold and took 3 days. Nobody said much. There wasn't much to say. The outskirts had been a lesson in how problems rarely had good solutions, and that was a lesson Geralt would carry with him whether he wanted to or not. The city gates loomed ahead, stone and iron, guards with crossbows, walls that were supposed to keep danger out, but mostly just kept people in. Geralt showed his letter. The guards checked it, nodded, waved him through. Welcome to Vizima, capital of Temeria. heart of what passed for civilization in this part of the continent, where politics was a blood sport and justice was negotiable, and a witcher without memory was about to discover that cities were far more dangerous than any wilderness could ever be. The gates closed behind him. The sound echoed like a door being locked. There was no going back now. Part 3. Vizima and Political Rot. Vizima was a city that smelled like smoke and shit, and something sweet that might have been incense or might have been bodies decomposing somewhere the guards hadn't found them yet. It was divided into sections: the Temple Quarter, where the Eternal Fire's influence was strongest; the Trade Quarter, where merchants conducted business and pretended they weren't all connected to crime syndicates; the Noble Quarter, off-limits to people like Geralt, unless they had very good reasons and very official papers; and Old Vizima, the slums where people who couldn't afford to live anywhere else tried to survive on nothing. Geralt started in the sewers, not by choice. The guards arrested him almost immediately, threw him in a cell, told him he'd get out when he killed the monster living in the waterways beneath the city. A cockatrice, big, poisonous, aggressive, exactly the kind of problem you solved by throwing witchers at it. He killed the cockatrice. It wasn't particularly difficult, more tedious than dangerous. The sewers were dark and wet and full of drowners, but drowners were easy. Muscle memory handled them. Stab, dodge, stab again, efficient. The guards let him out after that, gave him access to the Temple Quarter, told him to stay out of trouble, which was advice nobody ever followed. The Temple Quarter was where Geralt would spend most of his time. It was the working heart of Vizima, where guilds operated and merchants traded, and the Order of the Flaming Rose maintained their presence, where Salamandra had influence, where the clues about the stolen Witcher secrets might actually lead somewhere. But first, Geralt needed to understand the landscape, the power structures, who to trust and who to avoid, and who might be useful despite being neither. Vizima was at war with itself, not officially, no armies in the streets, but tension everywhere. You could feel it in how people moved, how they talked, how they looked at each other. Two factions, both armed, both convinced they were right, both preparing for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. On one side, the Order of the Flaming Rose, knights dedicated to protecting humanity from monsters and other threats. They wore armor emblazoned with the symbol of the Eternal Fire, preached about purity and righteousness, hunted monsters for free, which made them popular with common folk who couldn't afford Witcher prices. They also hated non-humans actively, aggressively. Elves, dwarves, halflings, anyone who didn't fit into their narrow definition of human was viewed with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. The Order saw themselves as humanity's shield, but shields can also be weapons when you turn them the right way. Their leader was Jacques de Aldersberg, the Grand Master, charismatic, passionate, the kind of man who could make you believe that burning the world down was actually saving it. He preached reform, change, a new order built on the ashes of the corrupt old one. People listened, people followed, people joined on the other side, the Scoia'tael, elvish guerrillas, freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on who you ask. They struck at human targets, burned supply carts, assassinated officials, made it clear that non-humans were done asking politely for equality. Their tactics were brutal, necessary, they'd argue. When peaceful protest accomplishes nothing, violence becomes the language everyone understands, but necessary doesn't mean clean. Innocent people died in Scoia'tael attacks, people whose only crime was being human in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their leader in the area was Yaevin, scarred, angry, the kind of person who'd seen enough injustice that he no longer believed in mercy. He fought because fighting was the only option that hadn't failed yet, and caught between these two groups. The regular people of Vizima, humans and non-humans who just wanted to work and eat and not die. They got no choice in the coming violence. They'd just be casualties when the storm finally broke. Geralt walked into this situation without memory of how to navigate it, but he was learning. He learned that the Scoia'tael had sympathizers in the city, people who provided safe houses, information, supplies. They believed in the cause, or they owed favors, or they were simply tired of watching non-humans suffer. He learned that the Order had support from King Foltest himself, at least officially. The king valued order over justice, stability over fairness. As long as the Order kept the peace, their methods were overlooked. He learned that both sides viewed Witchers as potential allies or potential threats, depending on how useful you seemed. Neutrality was a position you could take, but it wouldn't keep you safe. Eventually, you'd be forced to choose. Geralt chose to avoid choosing as long as possible. He had his own mission: find Salamandra, recover the Witcher secrets. Everything else was background noise. But background noise has a way of becoming foreground problems when you're not paying attention. Vincent Myers was a detective, city guard but higher rank, investigator, the kind of person who asked questions and followed evidence and tried to solve problems without immediately resorting to violence. He'd been investigating Salamandra, following their money trails, their connections, their operations in the city. He had suspects, people who might be involved, people who might know something useful. He enlisted Geralt's help. Witcher senses, Witcher experience, Witcher willingness to do things that official guards couldn't officially do. They formed a partnership, temporary, transactional, but effective. Together they investigated suspects, tracked leads, found evidence, discovered that Salamandra wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a criminal organization with goals beyond simple profit. They were experimenting, using the stolen mutagens from Kaer Morhen to create something: modified humans, enhanced humans, creatures that had human intelligence but Witcher strength, Witcher reflexes, without the tedious training or the decades of preparation. These experiments weren't stable. The modified people were aggressive, unpredictable, often insane, but they were effective, dangerous, the kind of weapon that could shift power balances if deployed correctly. Someone was funding this, someone with resources and ambition, someone who saw value in creating an army of modified soldiers who owed loyalty to whoever held their leash. Geralt needed to find who that someone was. The investigation led him deeper into Vizima's underworld, to warehouses where Salamandra conducted their experiments, to safe houses where mages worked on formulae that shouldn't exist, to meetings with people who knew pieces of the puzzle but never the whole picture. Raymond Marlowe was particularly helpful. A private investigator, smooth, well-connected, always seemed to know more than he should. He provided leads, names, location, helped Geralt track down Salamandra operations, and dismantle them piece by piece, until Raymond turned out to be Azar Javed in disguise, the mage from Kaer Morhen, the one who'd stolen the secrets in the first place. He'd been watching Geralt the entire time, feeding him information, leading him in circles, enjoying the game. The reveal happened in a crypt, surrounded by undead, because dramatic reveals require appropriate settings. Azar Javed dropped the Raymond disguise and attacked magic against steel, fire and lightning against a Witcher who'd forgotten how to be afraid. Geralt fought, nearly won. Then Azar Javed played his trump card. The professor appeared, the dancer with the twin blades. Together they overwhelmed Geralt. Not killed, that would be wasteful, just knocked unconscious, teleported to some nowhere place where he'd wake up hours later, confused and alone. Triss found him again. She seemed to make a habit of saving Geralt from his own recklessness, brought him back to consciousness, explained that Azar Javed and the professor had escaped again, but left clues, breadcrumbs that might lead somewhere useful. One of those breadcrumbs was Alvin, the boy from the outskirts, still young, still traumatized, still possessing powers he couldn't control. Triss had been looking after him, trying to help him understand his abilities, trying to keep him safe. But Salamandra wanted him, a source, a child with that much raw magical potential, could be useful, could be weaponized, could be studied to understand how power manifests in bloodlines. Geralt took responsibility for protecting Alvin, not because he wanted to be a father figure. He didn't know how to be a father to anyone, let alone a child who could see the future. But someone had to keep the boy safe, and Geralt was already in too deep to refuse. He had a choice to make. Who would care for Alvin when Geralt was traveling, fighting, investigating? Triss offered, Shani offered. Both had good arguments, both had flaws, both represented different paths, different futures, different commitments. Geralt chose. Doesn't matter which one, both choices had consequences. Both women had opinions about his decision. Relationships were complicated enough without adding amnesia and magical children to the mix. But Alvin was safe, for now, protected by magic and wards, and the slim hope that Salamandra wouldn't find him. The investigation continued. Vizima was preparing for violence. You could feel it building. The Scoia'tael were getting bolder. The Order was getting more aggressive. Clashes in the streets, bodies in the morning, the kind of escalation that ends with the city burning. King Foltest was trying to maintain control, but control was slipping. His advisors gave conflicting counsel. His forces were split between maintaining order and preparing for external threats. His daughter, Princess Ada, had her own agenda, which involved undermining her father's authority and positioning herself for succession. There was also a curse. Ada had been cursed once before, years ago, turned into a Striga, a monster that fed on corpses and killed anyone who got too close. Geralt had lifted that curse, or the Geralt who existed before amnesia had lifted it, saved the princess, allowed her to reclaim her humanity. Now the curse was back. Someone had reapplied it, turned Ada into a monster again. Political sabotage. Someone wanted Foltest weakened, distracted, dealing with personal crisis instead of governing effectively. Geralt took the contract, not because he particularly cared about royal family drama, but because lifting curses was Witcher work, and Witcher work paid also. Doing favors for kings tended to open doors. Dealing with the Striga required preparation, research. Understanding what had broken the curse the first time and what could break it again. There were two options: kill Ada, which would end the curse permanently but also end the princess, or subdue her without killing, break the curse again, save her life. Geralt chose. Again, the specifics matter less than the principle. Either way involved risk. Either way involved violence. Either way left Ada alive or dead. And the political ramifications of that choice would ripple outward in ways Geralt wouldn't see for months. But the immediate crisis was resolved. Foltest was grateful or heartbroken, depending on the outcome. Geralt received his payment. The contract was complete, and in exchange for his service, Foltest gave him information: the location of Salamandra's main base in Vizima, where Azar Javed was operating, where the stolen Witcher secrets were being used. It was time to end this, to recover what was stolen, to stop whatever Salamandra was building before it could be deployed. Geralt gathered his allies: Triss, Siegfried, a knight of the Order who'd proven trustworthy, or Yaevin, the Scoia'tael leader who saw value in stopping Salamandra, or neither. If Geralt had chosen pure neutrality, they assaulted the Salamandra base, fought through modified humans, through mages, through security measures that shouldn't have been possible. And at the center of it all, Azar Javed, the mage who'd started this, who'd attacked Kaer Morhen, who'd killed Leo, who'd been experimenting on people and pretending it was progress. The fight was brutal, magic and steel. Geralt pushed through defensive spells, through summoned creatures, through everything Azar-Javed could throw at him. And when the mage finally fell, when his blood pooled on stone and his eyes went empty, Geralt felt nothing. Just the absence where satisfaction should be. Just the knowledge that this wasn't over, because Azar-Javed had been working for someone, taking orders, following a plan that was larger than simple crime. The evidence pointed to the Order of the Flaming Rose, to Jacques de Aldersberg, to the Grand Master who preached purity while building an army of modified soldiers in secret. The Witcher secrets weren't gone, they just changed hands, moved from Salamandra to the Order. Same experiments, same goals, different letterhead. Geralt needed to confront Aldersberg, but first he needed to survive what was coming, because Vizima was about to burn. Part 4, the city in flames. The uprising happened overnight, or it felt like overnight. In reality, it had been building for weeks, months, years maybe. All that tension between the Scoia'tael and the Order finally found release. The Temple Quarter became a war zone. Elves and dwarves fighting humans, knights fighting rebels, everyone fighting everyone. Buildings burned, bodies lay in the streets. The city guard tried to maintain order and failed spectacularly. Geralt moved through the chaos like a ghost, not taking sides, not officially, but forced to choose moment by moment. This person needs help. That person is trying to kill you. This door leads to safety. That street is a death trap. He found Shani at the field hospital. She was covered in blood, not her own, trying to save lives in the middle of hell. Both sides kept attacking the hospital. Both sides claimed she was treating enemies. Both sides threatened to burn the building down. Geralt defended her, killed Scoia'tael, killed Order Knights, killed anyone who tried to hurt the only person in the city who was actually trying to help. It wasn't heroic, it was just necessary. The violence was casual, mechanical, stab, block, stab again. The hospital survived, barely. Shani survived, barely. The patients she'd been treating mostly died anyway from injuries too severe or infections too advanced or simple bad luck. Elsewhere in the city, the Scoia'tael executed civilians. The Order burned non-human districts. Princess Ada, curse lifted or not, used the chaos to stage a coup against her father. Salamandra remnants tried to exploit the situation for profit. Everyone had agendas. Everyone thought they were justified. It was exhausting. Through the smoke and screaming, Geralt made his way toward the Order's headquarters, the cloister, where de Aldersberg was waiting, where the Witcher secrets were being used to create the Grand Master's vision of the future. The path led through a sewer infested with Zeugl, because nothing in Vizima could ever be straightforward. The Zeugl was massive, tentacled, something that had been feeding on corpses for decades and had grown into something that barely qualified as alive anymore. Killing it required patience and disgust, and the knowledge that sometimes the worst monsters were the ones that lived in places people tried to ignore. Finally, Geralt reached the cloister, the Order's fortress in the heart of the city. Stone walls, armed guards, and inside, Jacques de Aldersberg, surrounded by his chosen few. The people he'd decided deserved to survive what was coming. Geralt confronted him, demanded answers, demanded the Witcher secrets back, demanded to know what the Grand Master thought he was accomplishing. Jacques de Aldersberg told him, Part 5, Alvin and the Fear of the Future. The Grand Master spoke about the White Frost, about Ithlin's prophecy, about the end of the world. He wasn't raving, wasn't insane. That was the disturbing part. He was calm, rational, explained his vision like a teacher presenting facts to a student who hadn't been paying attention. The White Frost was coming, an ice age, a global catastrophe that would freeze the world, kill most living things, reduce civilization to scattered survivors huddling around dying fires. It was inevitable, prophesied by elven seers centuries ago, confirmed by visions, by patterns in history, by the gradual cooling that anyone paying attention could observe. Humanity wasn't ready, wasn't strong enough, wasn't unified. When the frost came, people would turn on each other, would fight over scraps, would die in chaos and fear, unless someone prepared them, unless someone created the tools for survival, unless someone built an army strong enough to protect the chosen ones during the migration south, away from the killing cold. That's what de Aldersberg was doing, creating mutant soldiers using Witcher secrets, not out of megalomaniacal ambition, not for power, for survival, for humanity's last chance. The Greater Brothers, he called them, enhanced humans, all the strength and speed of Witchers, none of the emotions or doubts that made Witchers unreliable. Perfect soldiers who'd follow orders without question, who'd protect the faithful during humanity's darkest hour. It was a beautiful plan, logical, well-reasoned, completely insane. Geralt listened, tried to find flaws in the reasoning, tried to explain that creating slave soldiers to force humanity into submission wasn't salvation. It was tyranny. That the cure was worse than the disease. De Aldersberg didn't agree, couldn't agree. His visions had shown him the future, had shown him what happened when humanity was left to its own devices, extinction, horror, the end of everything. He'd seen it through Alvin's eyes. That was the reveal, the connection Geralt should have realized earlier. De Aldersberg and Alvin, different names, same person. Alvin had disappeared months ago, vanished from whatever care Geralt had left him in, used his powers, his source abilities, to travel through time. Backward or forward, time was negotiable when you could see across it. He'd gone to the past, become Jacques de Aldersberg, founded the Order, spent years building toward this moment, all because he'd seen the future and couldn't accept what he'd seen. The boy who'd been traumatized by violence had grown into a man who thought violence was the answer. The child who'd seen atrocities had become the adult who committed them. Somewhere in that journey, Alvin had broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, and now he stood before Geralt, older but somehow younger, tired but determined, offering one last chance. Join me, help me save humanity. Together we can make this work. Geralt refused, not because he had a better plan. He didn't. But because following de Aldersberg's plan meant accepting that fear justified tyranny, that good intentions excused evil actions, that the end always justified the means. Some things weren't negotiable. De Aldersberg looked disappointed, but not surprised. He'd known this was coming, had probably seen this confrontation in his visions, had hoped, perhaps, that knowing the future would change it. But the future didn't change. It just arrived. He raised his hand, reality fractured, and suddenly Geralt wasn't in Vizima anymore. Part 6. The Ice Plains and Inevitable Death. The cold hit like a physical blow. Wind that stripped flesh from bone. Snow that buried everything. A landscape of white and gray and nothing. This was de Aldersberg's vision. The ice plains, the future he'd seen, Vizima frozen, the world frozen, everything buried under ice that would never melt. It might have been a hallucination, a magical construct, a dream space where thought became environment, or it might have been real, a glimpse of the actual future pulled into the present. Didn't matter. The cold was real enough to kill. Geralt moved forward. Not because he knew where he was going, because standing still meant dying. His breath frosted in the air, his fingers went numb. The landscape shifted with each step, paths appearing and disappearing, logic abandoning all pretense. Triss appeared, or Shani, depending on who Geralt had chosen. A projection, a helper, someone to guide him through this frozen nightmare. She explained that this place was built from fear and foresight, de Aldersberg's terror made manifest. but also Geralt's will, his refusal to accept this future, their opposing visions wrestling for dominance. They walked together through ruins of Vizima, through frozen corpses, through memories and possibilities and things that might never happen if someone was brave or foolish enough to prevent them. Monsters appeared, skull heads, spectral beings, mutants, the greater brothers that de Aldersberg had created. They attacked without mercy. Geralt killed them without hesitation. The violence was clean, efficient, meaningless in the grand scheme, but necessary in the moment. Behind him, the wild hunt followed, always at the edge of perception, riders on skeletal horses, the king of the wild hunt, watching, waiting. Geralt had seen them before, in fragments of memory, in dreams that might have been real. They'd chased him before he lost his memory, were chasing him still. Death, pursuing death, forward, always forward, toward de Aldersberg's vision, toward the confrontation that couldn't be avoided. Greater brothers attacked in waves, 5 at a time, coordinated, professional, everything de Aldersberg had promised they'd be. Geralt cut through them, used signs, potions, everything he'd learned and relearned. His body moved on autopilot, muscle memory layered over instinct, layered over desperation. A head, a tower, the last standing structure in the frozen wasteland. De Aldersberg waited there. One final conversation, one final chance. Geralt climbed each step harder than the last, the cold intensifying, the wind howling, the sense that the world was narrowing down to this single point, this single moment. At the top, Jacques de Aldersberg stood alone. No guards, no mutants, just the Grand Master and his convictions. He spoke again about the White Frost, about humanity's need for harsh shepherds, about how witchers themselves had been created through suffering. So why shouldn't he create soldiers the same way? About how sometimes salvation required cruelty. Geralt said nothing, nothing left to say. They'd both stated their positions, both believed they were right, both knew words wouldn't change anything. The fight began. Part 7. Jacques de Aldersberg and the weight of trauma. Steel against magic. Geralt's swords against de Aldersberg's spells. The duel unfolded in stages, each more desperate than the last. The Grand Master was powerful. Source powers combined with decades of training. Fire and ice and lightning, summoning mutants mid-battle, teleporting to avoid strikes. Everything a frightened child had learned to do to protect himself. Refined into weapons that could end civilizations, Geralt pressed forward, dodged, blocked, waited for openings. His fighting style was patient, economical. Let the enemy exhaust themselves while you stayed fresh. Basic Witcher training, effective because it was simple. The battle moved through the tower, up and down stairs, through rooms that shifted geometry, reality bending around their conflict, the ice planes responding to their wills, neither fully in control, both fighting for dominance. De Aldersberg summoned specters, ghosts of people Geralt had killed or failed to save. The Reverend from the outskirts, if Geralt had killed him, Abigail, if he'd let her die, Siegfried or Yaevin, depending on choices made. They attacked with the conviction of the dead, and Geralt killed them again. The ghosts weren't real, just manifestations of guilt, of doubt, of the weight that accumulated when you made decisions in a world without good options. Geralt knew they weren't real, killed them anyway, because in this place, guilt had weight and weapons. Finally, after what felt like hours but might have been minutes, de Aldersberg faltered, his magic depleted, his strength failing. He fell to one knee, breathing hard, looking up at Geralt with eyes that were still Alvin's eyes underneath the Grand Master's face. Geralt raised his sword, steel blade, the one for humans, hesitated. This was a child, traumatized, broken by what he'd seen in the outskirts, by what he'd seen in his visions. by the impossible burden of trying to save everyone from a future that maybe couldn't be changed. But it was also Jacques de Aldersberg, the man who'd ordered Leo's death, who'd experimented on people, who'd created an army of slaves and called it salvation, who'd started a war in Vizima and called it necessary preparation. The sword fell. De Aldersberg gasped, "Blood, so much blood." He looked surprised, which was strange because he'd seen this coming, had known how it would end. Maybe seeing the future and accepting it were different things. His last gesture was reaching for something around his neck. An amulet, dimeritium, the metal that suppressed magic, old worn, the same amulet Geralt had given Alvin months ago to help control his powers. Still wearing it, still trying to control something that couldn't be controlled. He whispered something. Geralt couldn't hear it over the wind. Then he was gone. Not dramatically, not peacefully, just gone dead. Another body in a world full of them. The Wild Hunt arrived then, their king stepping forward, casual as anything. He looked at de Aldersberg's corpse, looked at Geralt, made an offer. "Give me his soul, or fight me, your choice." Geralt chose. Doesn't matter which. Either he surrendered de Aldersberg to eternal hunting, or he fought the king and was told that death always wins eventually, that they'd meet again. Either way, the Wild Hunt departed. Their business here concluded. The ice plains collapsed, or melted, or never existed. Geralt woke up in Vizima, in the cloister, Dandelion hovering over him, worried and relieved. The battle was over. The Order had been defeated, or had surrendered, or had won, depending on which side Geralt had supported during the uprising. The city was still burning in places, but the worst of the fighting had stopped. King Foltest was restoring order. Princess Ada was dead, or cured, or imprisoned, depending on earlier choices. The Scoia'tael were retreating. The Order was disbanding or being absorbed into the royal military. Everything was going back to normal, whatever normal meant. Geralt searched de Aldersberg's body, found the Witcher secrets. The stolen formulae from Kaer Morhen, still intact, still usable. Mission accomplished. He also found the amulet, held it, felt its weight, understood, finally, the connection, the loop. The boy who'd become the man who'd tried to save the boy who'd never existed outside his own fears. Time was strange when magic was involved. Causality was negotiable. Alvin had been Jacques de Aldersberg, but also hadn't been, but also would be, but also never was. The contradiction hurt to think about. Geralt pocketed the amulet, left the cloister, walked out into Vizima's smoking streets. People were picking up pieces, literal pieces in some cases, bodies, debris, lives. The city would recover. Cities always did, but the scars would remain. Dandelion asked what Geralt would do next, where he'd go. The path was calling again. More contracts, more monsters, more cities that needed someone to solve their problems. Geralt didn't answer immediately. He looked at the sky. Gray, always gray. The sun was up there somewhere, but the clouds were too thick to prove it. He'd recovered the Witcher secrets, completed his mission, avenged Leo's death, done everything Vesemir had asked. But he still didn't remember. Didn't know who he'd been before Kaer Morhen. Didn't know the people he'd lost, or the life he'd lived, or the things that made him the White Wolf instead of just another Witcher with white hair. The amnesia remained, a hole where identity should be, a blank space he was slowly filling with new memories, new choices, new scars. Maybe that was fine. Maybe the man he'd been didn't matter as much as the man he was becoming. Maybe the past was just another thing you couldn't control, like the weather or other people's choices or prophecies about ice ages that may or may not come true. He started walking, didn't know where yet, didn't need to. The path would present itself. It always did. Behind him, Vizima continued recovering. Ahead, The continent stretched out vast and indifferent. Somewhere out there, more problems waited, more monsters, more moral ambiguity, more situations without good answers. Geralt would find them, or they'd find him. Either way, he'd deal with them the only way he knew how. One contract at a time, Part 8. The Endings and Lingering Silence. The game presented 3 possible endings, 3 divergent paths based on choices made throughout Geralt's journey. But the differences were cosmetic, surface level. Underneath, they all told the same story. If Geralt had sided with the Order of the Flaming Rose, Siegfried became the new Grand Master, reformed the organization, tried to steer it toward actual protection of people instead of xenophobic aggression. Foltest supported them, used them as a tool for maintaining order in Temeria. The Scoia'tael were crushed, driven underground, their rebellion ending in fire and blood. Non-humans went back to being oppressed, just with better organized oppressors. If Geralt had sided with the Scoia'tael, Yaevinn led them to a brief victory. The Order was destroyed, its knights killed or scattered. Non-humans gained temporary breathing room, but Foltest's army arrived eventually, restored order through overwhelming force. The Scoia'tael were hunted down. Yaevinn escaped, probably to fight another day, but the rebellion was over. Equality remained a dream deferred. If Geralt had remained neutral, both sides tore each other apart. The Order and the Scoia'tael fought until neither had strength left. Foltest's army swept in and cleaned up the mess, imposed martial law, arrested everyone. The city calmed under the weight of swords and suspicion, peace through exhaustion. 3 endings, all unsatisfying, all realistic, all reflecting the fundamental truth that complex problems rarely have clean solutions, and that trying to fix everything usually just shifts the pain around instead of eliminating it. But those were the political endings, the official conclusions to the conflict in Vizima. They mattered to the people who lived in that city, to the historians who'd write about these events decades later. For Geralt, the ending was quieter, more personal, more ordinary. He returned to Kaer Morhen briefly, delivered the Witcher secrets to Vesemir. Mission accomplished. The old Witcher accepted them without much fanfare, locked them away somewhere safe, said they'd probably never be used, couldn't be used, really. The knowledge of how to perform the trials properly had been lost years ago. These formulae were incomplete without the context, the trained personnel, the infrastructure that no longer existed, but they were home. That was enough. Geralt didn't stay long. Kaer Morhen felt even emptier now, knowing that it would never again produce new Witchers, that the Wolf School was dying by attrition, that in 50 years, maybe less, there'd be no Witchers at all, just stories, legends, old men in taverns claiming they once knew a mutant who killed monsters. He said goodbye to Lambert and Eskel. They were going back to the path, following leads, chasing rumors of contracts. The work continued until it didn't, until there were no more monsters to hunt or no more Witchers to hunt them. Vesemir stayed behind. Someone had to maintain the keep, preserve what could be preserved. He was old enough to remember when Kaer Morhen had been full of life, full of boys training to become something terrible and necessary. Now it was just stone and memories. Geralt left, walked down the mountain, didn't look back this time, no point. Triss went to Vizima's academy. She'd been offered a position, teaching, research, the kind of stable life that sorceresses rarely had. She asked Geralt to come with her. Not as a permanent arrangement, just, more often, visit, stay, be something more than ships passing. He didn't answer, not directly, said he'd think about it, which they both knew meant no. But saying no directly felt cruel. Shani continued her medical work, stayed in Vizima. The city needed healers more than ever. She didn't ask Geralt to stay, knew better. Just told him to be careful, try not to die. Come back if he ever got tired of wandering. Simple advice, impossible to follow completely. Alvin was gone, vanished into time, was or wasn't or would be. Jacques de Aldersberg, depending on how you understood causality. The Dimeritium amulet sat in Geralt's pack, a reminder of a boy he'd failed to save by succeeding at killing him. Time travel made everything complicated. The continent continued, wars and peace, and wars again, borders shifting, kings rising and falling. The same cycles humanity had been repeating since the conjunction of the spheres brought monsters and magic to this world. Geralt walked through it like a ghost, the White Wolf, the Witcher without memory, the man who'd saved or doomed Vizima depending on your perspective. He took contracts, killed monsters, moved from town to town. People recognized him sometimes. The white hair, the scars, the swords. They'd heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, some completely fabricated. He didn't correct them, didn't confirm or deny. Just took their money when the job was done and moved on. The amnesia remained. Triss's attempts at magical recovery had failed. The memories weren't locked away, they were gone, destroyed by whatever had happened in those missing 5 years. The man Geralt had been was dead. The man he was now was a collection of recent experiences, muscle memory, and an overwhelming sense of not quite belonging anywhere. It was fine. He could live with that. Lots of people lived with worse. Sometimes, late at night, staying in cheap inns or camping in forests, Geralt wondered about the White Frost, about de Aldersberg's visions, about whether the Ice Age was really coming or whether it was just the fevered hallucination of a traumatized boy with too much power. He didn't know, couldn't know. Prophecies were tricky, malleable, often self-fulfilling. You see disaster coming, you act to prevent it. Your actions cause it. Classic paradox. But whether the White Frost was real or not, people would keep living, keep struggling, keep making the best of bad situations. Humanity was good at that, at surviving, at adapting, at finding reasons to continue when all logic suggested they should give up. Witchers were good at surviving too. Mutations ensured it. But survival wasn't the same as living, and living required more than just not dying required purpose, meaning connection to something beyond the next contract. Geralt didn't have that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he kept walking anyway. The path led through a village, small, forgettable, the kind of place that existed only because people needed somewhere to exist. A notice board outside the tavern advertised contracts. A drowner problem near the river, missing livestock, probably neckers. The usual. Geralt read the notices, picked one, went to talk to the alderman about payment. The alderman looked at him with the expression people always wore when looking at witchers. Suspicion, fear, reluctant necessity. Named a price, low, insulting, really, but Geralt had stopped caring about proper payment somewhere between Vizima and nowhere. He took the contract, gathered his gear, headed toward the river. The sun was setting, gray sky turning darker gray. Rain starting to fall, light at first, then heavier. The smell of wet earth and distant smoke. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere else someone laughed, life continuing. Ordinary, mundane. The kind of day that repeated endlessly for people who weren't caught up in prophecies or political coups or time-traveling children. Geralt walked, his boots squelched in mud. His coat was already soaked. Didn't matter. Witchers didn't get cold easily. Another gift of the mutations. The drowners would be waiting patient, hungry, no malice in them, just instinct and appetite. He'd kill them efficiently, collect his payment, move on to the next town, the next contract, the next problem that needed solving. It wasn't glory, wasn't heroism, wasn't the kind of life people wrote songs about, but it was his life, the only one he had, the only one he could remember, and that would have to be enough. The rain continued falling, the world turned cold and dark and wet, and somewhere in that darkness a witcher moved through his work, steady and methodical and alone. The story had ended, the grand conflict resolved, the stolen secrets recovered, the Grand Master dead, the city saved or doomed depending on your metrics. But Geralt kept walking, because stories end but life doesn't. Life just keeps going, one moment after another, one day into the next, until eventually you run out of days. And until then, you do what you can with what you have. You walk the path. You kill monsters. You try not to hurt innocent people. You make the best choices available when good choices aren't options. You survive. And maybe that's all anyone can do. Maybe that's enough. The world had forgotten who Geralt of Rivia used to be. He'd forgotten himself, but the path remembered, the monsters remembered, the contracts remembered, and so he continued, white hair in the rain, silver sword on his back. No past, uncertain future, only the present moment stretching out before him. The continent had moved on without him once, had barely noticed when he returned, and when he was gone again, it would keep turning, keep changing, keep being the messy, complicated, morally ambiguous place it had always been. But for now, he was here, walking through mud and rain, hunting something that needed hunting, existing in the small ways that don't make history but make life possible. The drowners waited ahead. Geralt could smell them, rot and river water, simple creatures with simple needs. He drew his silver sword. The blade caught what little light remained. Beautiful in a way, functional, honest, made for one purpose and serving that purpose well, just like him. He stepped forward into the darkness, into the rain, into whatever came next, and the world barely noticed. That's where The Witcher 1 leaves us. Not with triumph, not with tragedy, just with continuation. With the understanding that life goes on whether you remember it or not, that legends fade into ordinary days, that sometimes the greatest story is the one nobody writes down. Geralt would continue, would find Yennefer eventually, would remember slowly who he'd been, would discover that destiny had plans for him regardless of what he wanted, would meet Ciri and fight the Wild Hunt and save the world in the dramatic, consequential ways that The Witcher 3 would showcase. But those are different stories, later stories, stories that built on this foundation of mud and rain and moral exhaustion. The Witcher 1 is about forgetting and being forgotten, about returning to a world that doesn't need you, about discovering that your legendary status means nothing when you're standing in a village, negotiating payment for killing drowners. It's about the quiet moments, the walks between towns, the contracts that don't change anything, the choices that leave everyone unhappy, the understanding that sometimes you can't save everyone, can't fix everything, can't even remember why you thought you could. It's about doing the work anyway, walking the path anyway, surviving anyway. And maybe that's more heroic than any grand gesture. The simple act of continuing when continuing seems pointless, of helping when help is neither appreciated nor rewarded, of trying to be decent in a world that makes decency difficult. That was Geralt's story in 2007. That was what The Witcher 1 offered players. Not power fantasy, not chosen one narratives, just a amnesiac witcher trying to figure out who he was by watching what he did, building identity from actions rather than memories. It was slow, clunky, gray and muddy and exhausting. It was perfect. Thank you for walking this path with me, for spending these hours in the rain and mud and moral ambiguity of The Witcher's first game, for listening to a story about a man the world had already forgotten. If you enjoyed this journey, if it helped you sleep or think or simply pass time in a way that felt meaningful, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, letting me know in the comments which parts resonated, which choices you made, which version of Geralt you became when you played through this story. The Witcher trilogy continues with Assassins of Kings and Wild Hunt, stories about politics and destiny and the weight of consequences, but they all started here, in the outskirts, in the mud, with a man who didn't know his own name learning to be himself again through the work of his hands. It's late now. You're tired. That's fine, that's good. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the rain continue falling in your mind. Let the path stretch out ahead and behind in equal measure. And remember, the world may forget you, you may forget yourself, but the work remains, the path remains, the next day always comes. Until next time, sleep well, walk carefully, and may your silver sword never tarnish. The story has ended, the world barely noticed, and somewhere in the rain, a Witcher continues.